For anyone who hasn't joined us before and hasn't seen me present, I'm Stuart Peck. I'm the host of Zero Day Live. I'm also the Director of Cybersecurity Strategy for Zero Day Lab, heading up education, training, lots of incident response work, GRC, social engineering. I mean, you can read all this stuff, but ultimately, we're going to talk about the kind of managed detection response today, which is some of the areas that I look after. But I am incredibly lucky and privileged to be joined by the wonderful Pete Farrell.
Thank you for that, and equally just as good an introduction, actually.
It was quite good.
Thanks very much, yeah. I have less bullet points on mine, but my name is Peter Farrell. I'm the Sales Director at Zero Day Lab. And really, I guess from a focus standpoint, for the last sort of 6 years, I've worked very closely with MDR solutions, working in terms of strategy with customers, and really looking at adding value to organisations.
Excellent, thank you very much. And we've got lots to talk about today as well, really importantly. So I want to be very clear about the kind of format. We're going to talk about managed detection response and the importance of it. We're going to talk about the importance of SOC, and we're going to talk about the importance of bringing detection earlier in the life cycle and how you go about doing that. We've got lots of great bits of advice and hopefully lots of debate between myself and Peter. But this is an interactive session, so if you have any questions at all, please ask them in the chat, which is located probably one of these sides. I can't remember which side. I'm pretty sure it's this side. Ask that in the chat, and we'll get through those questions as soon as we can. But let's talk about the threat landscape. So, like all these sessions, we talk about, the very first seminar that we did was we talking about the importance of incident response preparedness, and actually that very much ties into this session and ties into the part that how managed detection and response very much ties into incident response preparedness and also how you manage and deal with incidents. And of course, if we look at how attackers are delivering a range of attacks against organisations, against what is considered to be quite a vast and large kind of attack surface in most organisations, we are looking at sort of things like initial compromise being the kind of phishing or smishing, or open services and ports that might be left open. Things like leaving exposed SSH keys or AWS keys or things like this, or maybe leaving things like RDP open to the internet, which is always the primary example of how to get ransomware. But we're looking at today where we bring that detection into that process. The earlier we can detect that initial activity and we can correlate that across multiple sources, the more chance we'll be able to make in determining whether something needs containing, investigating, or what the level of attack we're having against us, but also what assets they're targeting and what effort we put into remediating those. So today is going to be very much focused on understanding the importance of detection and response and the importance of when and how to deliver that detection capability. So I like to use examples and real-world examples, and I think this is a really good one from a ransomware family, and also a ransomware family that delivers it as a service. So one of the kind of top 4 that use the same process. And what we're looking at here is initial compromise. That initial compromise can come through different ways. We can look at phishing attacks. We can look at someone having an exposed key or something like that can be used, or exposed credentials, or reused credentials, or admin credentials, whatever it may be. Right? An attacker's going to deliver something or get something to deliver that initial kind of compromise. Now, when we talk about detection, we should be really thinking about detecting this here, because this is a really good indicator of something bad that's going to happen. Something bad has already happened, but we can potentially do something about that. We can remove access, we can potentially change passwords, we can lock out, we can kick the device off the network, the service off the network, whatever it may be, right? We've got a way to kind of contain that initially to stop something really bad happening. Really, when we start to get further down the chain, we'll start to think about detection being round about here, or maybe being notified that you've actually had a breach and you've got a ransomware attack, or your data's left the network, or you're being notified by a third party, which is even worse. So we're talking about the earlier you detect in that cycle, the less you have to deal with and the less complex it is, right? And
that's actually determined by the way in which you define the service from day one, from ground zero ultimately, and how you position that, how you define the service in terms of what you're recognising, what you're hunting for, what you're looking for, what the processes are that will determine that will enable you to detect earlier in the process rather than later.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're going to talk about as well, Pete, is going to be about that importance of connecting the dots between the business, right? What the business recognises as being important and technically what we're looking for, right? And we've got some examples here as well, for example. So if we look at, ransomware as a great example because it's easily referenceable, right? So if you look at where, we detect that initial compromise and we're able to contain it early on in the process, of course, logically, you're going to stop the attack. But if your detection capability is slightly less sophisticated, or you don't have the right resources, or the attacker has managed to circumvent those controls you have in place, we're now talking about much larger impact. For example, inhibiting your ability to recover. If we manage to look at our backups and our recovery mechanisms, and we have alerts around those, and we're able to see changes to those, or something happening, we can stop that straight away. Fantastic. If they're segregated, so we're forcing the attacker to make errors, even better, right? So we're trying to build up that kind of detection, kind of in depth almost in that sense. So the lower down we go down, if the attackers manage to exfiltrate data, we have no ability to see how data is leaving the organisation, then we're in a big problem there.
Yep.
So the lower down it is, the more we have to deal with, the more complex. If we know about the attack at the point we get the ransom, we've got all those things to deal with.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to, it's how you define the service. It's how you define what you would call a use case and what components fit those use cases, which will enable you to be more effective in the detection.
Absolutely. And I think, real key to this is about identifying those processes, right? And identifying, those usual kind of suspects of, well, these are things that we really care about, and these are the assets that we really care about, and we obviously want to merge that together and go, we want to stop this from happening against these things. And it's very simplistically pretty much what we're doing, right? And when we talk about the usual suspects, this is why the importance of monitoring is in place. We're talking about the usual suspect of, in most cases, we're talking about Cobalt Strike and the ability of the attackers to use a very flexible service. As soon as someone has actually deployed Cobalt Strike and you haven't detected it, and you have then got an attacker who can mask their traffic, who can embed themselves or hollow into processes to mask how they've bound themselves to services, to completely have command and control of those services and pivot and be able to then infect more services as they move through the network, and also hide that traffic through what looks like legitimate means or poisoning DNS. The suite of capability within that is almost limitless. So we really should be thinking about having that predefined kind of profile of what good looks like, or what normal looks like, or what processes happen and what services we have that are enabled, to be able to monitor those, to say, well, hang on a second, if we can detect that earlier and we can stop it really quickly, we stop the headache of having these types of tools being deployed, command and control tools and all this kind of stuff, to make our life a nightmare when it comes to doing threat hunting, when it comes to doing instant response. And it also comes down to that whole adage of, when we get rid of an attacker off the network, the confidence to say we've actually got rid of them, right?
Yeah. And that, that is right at the very start. It's having the expertise, it's having the knowledge, and it's having a good understanding of what it is that you think good looks like. And when you've got those combinations you can put together, it's all in the deployment of the service, and it's all in defining that service. And I keep saying this, but it is. Yeah. Because you can deploy an MDR solution, and it may not quite fit the business in terms of what you want to see out of that, and that will impact on the value of the service itself.
Isn't that like any other service, right? We were jokingly chatting about this before this seminar, about when you look at shelfware, right? So you buy a solution because it's a bright, shiny box and it's got the best flashing lights, and it's promised you the earth, and you're using it for this one use case because it's solving that particular problem. That person buys it for that use case, don't use the full functionality, or they don't understand what functionality they're getting. That person then leaves the business because they've not documented it, and all that knowledge leaves with them. It gets shelved. Yeah,
exactly.
It's the kind of same thing, right?
Yeah, and that actually does take you back, and I'm sure we're going to cover this in the slides as we go through, but it really does take you back, and we'll come back to the point, because again, I think it's an important one, is that an MDR solution is really defined also by policies, procedures, roles, responsibilities, because that will enable you to, let's look at the MDR in itself is there to enable an organisation to make decisions on how to respond. And to do that, you've got to be able to detect, and you've got to be able to have the capabilities to monitor. And as long as you can respond and know how to respond in certain circumstances, that's the value of the service. And you only get that if roles, responsibilities, processes and procedures are all defined as part of the MDR solution, and that you're in a position to be prepared. And I'm sure we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail as we go through.
Oh, absolutely. And do you know what, Peter? The thing about for me is very much about the ability to consume that information, right? So as you rightly said, it's about the ability to do the preparedness. So understand if we have an incident that comes through or an event that comes through, and it gets sent to, let's say, the security team or the service desk or whoever it's going to be that will be the incident handler in that particular case. Do they know what to do with that? Do they know who to escalate it to? Do they know the information? Do they have the right information at their fingertips? And if you have an in-house SOC, you may have that ability for them to triage themselves and own it. But then, of course, what happens once that process is complete? Do they then go and chuck it over to service desk to fix it? Do they speak to the infrastructure team? What happens to that information? Whatever you consume, the information that you do consume has to be the right information, and you have to have the right plans, processes, procedures, and framework in place to be able to say, right, we know it's a critical asset, we know this is happening on that asset, and we've also got the plan in place to know this is something that needs to be contained straight away, this is how we're going to resolve it, and then we're going to feed that back into the loop, right, which kind of takes us quite nicely into why blind spots are punishing, which is kind of like we almost planned this, right?
Yeah, you would think that.
Yeah, and we all have, and we've talked about this, and I think the previous slide may have kind of highlighted, there are going to be some blind spots to some degree, regardless whether you have an in-house SOC or you're using a service already. There's always going to be something that attackers will kind of try and circumvent. And for me, it's like, if we talk about the average time to detect a breach is, 228 days and all that kind of stuff, that's kind of okay information. That gives you kind of a yardstick for the some companies might take 24 hours to detect something, and actually, because they've got to kind of the maturity of monitoring, and some companies may never detect anything. It might be like a month, 2 years, whatever it may be, right? So you've got that whole ability to say there is a big delta in detection. But for me, the one thing that really stands out against all of this is the rise in of criminal services such as access as a service, where an attacker compromises a network or compromises a number of critical devices on a network and establishes access to that network or through approved services, whatever it may be, right? And sells that. Now, if that market, that particular criminal market, is growing to support ransomware as a service, for example, that clearly is an indicator we're getting not worse at detection, but criminals are getting better at hiding themselves, hiding from detection, evading detection, right? And this is actually quite a really important point, because you can correlate the two. And actually, this is why the importance of having those established profiles, having those baselines of what known good looks like to some degree, and understanding the business processes that sit around that may spot those anomalies is quite important.
Yeah, and look, when we approach an MDR solution, we use the phrase crawl, walk, run. It's not something you're going to take on board from day one, and that solution is going to be the end product ultimately, because if you look at MDR as a solution, effectively it's a journey. And what looks good now may not necessarily be the term of what good looks like in 3 months or 6 months down the line. As you start to get to know your network better, and you start to pull the logs in and normalize the data that's been put out there, and you start to make different decisions. Now, that will change, and ultimately the capacity of that service can vastly increase over time, but the important thing is that it's underpinned and that the business understands it fully. And then ultimately, I think we come back onto it, is how we then prod that environment and ensure that A, it does work and detect in the way that you want it to, and B, everybody that sits around it supporting the business knows exactly what their roles are.
And just to add to that as well, environments change, right? Yeah. So not only does the landscape change, the use cases change, the detection capability change, and the attacks itself changes environments, migrations, things like this. So the service has to evolve and be able to flex with what is ultimately a moving landscape, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because one of the advantages of having a partner provide that kind of service is that you do get the feeds from other services and the information that's pulled into the SOC from that side of it that you then benefit from to protect your estate. Even though you don't necessarily consume those services as individual services, they will form part of the capability and knowledge that sit behind that SOC capability.
And it's that shared intelligence, isn't it?
Yeah,
and so, you'll have your own specific use cases and sort of detection capability based on your profile, your organisation, the things that you're particularly worried about. And then you get the shared benefit of seeing what is happening. So if there's a particular event that's happening at the moment and we've got an indicator of compromise for that, there's a particular vulnerability to be able to monitor for that vulnerability. If there's a particular attack that's happened within an organisation that's particularly unique and we've been able to monitor that, that indicator of compromise becomes a use case for everyone else. And if that's happening across multiple kind of environments, all of a sudden you've got this kind of continuously growing kind of suite of detection capability that you wouldn't necessarily get just in a single tenant SOC, because you're only seeing what you're seeing, if that makes sense, and you're only detecting the attacks that you are able to within the realms of dual network. But if you're having potentially like hundreds or tens or whatever it may be of these things happening all the time, you're getting that kind of shared capability.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we may have driven home the importance of monitoring. Right?
Yeah, I think so.
I think we might have covered that off a tiny bit, right? But I have got one last thing, and if you have been to our first seminar, I have used this before, but I want to give it the slant of today's talk because it's quite important. This actually goes back to everything we do when we talk about instant response and detection and managed detection response in itself, right? And this is kind of my pyramid of pain of monitoring, right? And it really is quite that simple. When we talk about the threats, do we know who our adversaries are? Now, you could say, in most cases, depending on the data that you have and depending on the intelligence you're consuming, you probably would have some idea of who might want to target you, right? And then you would want to understand, do you know the assets you're defending? And in most cases, we ask the old age question that we ask every single time, and every single customer meeting I have is, do you have an up-to-date asset register, right? And most of them will go, well, we have an asset register, is it up to date? When was it last updated, right? Is it, have you done a business impact analysis against that? So you know who your critical assets are, right? And then of course, mostly it's like, well, we kind of do and we kind of don't. So how can you expect to monitor for attacks against your critical assets if you don't know where your critical assets are? And you also don't know the attack paths to those assets. So you can't actually then start to put traps in place to kind of pick up those things as they go through. And of course, if you don't have visibility across those critical assets because you haven't identified them, then there's obviously an issue there, right? So we need to be able to do that. And then this is where it gets quite interesting because you may be able to detect unauthorized activity. You may have endpoint detection and response. You may have a anti-malware. You may have some form of smart monitoring. You may have an intrusion detection system. So you probably can detect unauthorized activity. But then do you have the capability to be able to accurately classify those detection results, to actually say, this isn't a false positive, or this is this particular group here, or this is a particular activity that was led from this particular point of origin. So we're seeing it a lot further down the attack path, and actually we're seeing a later stage attack here, which is kind of concerning, right? And actually that's a big thing to worry about. And then if we're then picking up those and creating those indicators of compromise, so we're seeing file hashes, we're seeing IP addresses, we're seeing, whatever it may be, right? Network artifacts or artifacts that we can basically see, and we're able to classify those and actually then be able to search them across the network and see where they may have appeared. That's quite a difficult thing to do unless you've got the logs to be able to say, we've seen this over here, we've seen this over here. So we're not dealing with an isolated incident anymore. We're dealing with something that's potentially a bit more widespread. Right? And so if you don't have that ability, you don't have that visibility as well, then of course that becomes a bigger issue when we come to talk about
and that point there about the analysis and correlation of that information, that's key. Because if you think about it, you could procure SIM technologies, you can implement technologies that will drive logs into a central base, but it's about knowing and understanding what a risk looks like within your business, in the environment of your organisation, and then ultimately understanding what that data is telling you. Because that could be realms and realms and realms of logs and data that get presented in front of you, and there might actually be something in there that's of real concern. But having the expertise to be able to sift through that, categorise them, and place them into is that a risk, or is that not a risk? Is that just something we expect to see, a false positive in there?
Yeah, absolutely, and that comes down to having the right analysts with the right experience. With the right use cases to pick up some of these things automatically, and then obviously then feed that into a queue to be able to go, no, that's not right, that's false positive, that's good. And then also being able to hunt, because ultimately you can't just be reactive. which actually brings me on to hunt as well.
Yeah.
And being able to hunt, right, which is really important, because you don't want to be reacting to things. You want to be checking. You want to be building up detection capability to see the least common things that happen in your environment, right? So, a process, the least common process that spins up, for example, in Windows systems, that's probably something you want to look at, because if it's least common, then it's not widely distributed. That might be an indicator, or unknown locations, or least common locations, or it could be IP addresses that fall within the detection capability that happen more frequently than within these windows of hours, or the impossible login situation, all that kind of stuff, right? Where you can't be logging in from the US and the UK at the same time. Well, you probably can, but the whole point is, we're trying to find those things to hunt for proactively rather than reacting to what's happening. We should be thinking about being more proactive in our approach.
Yeah, because I think just by being able to define those enables you to decide ultimately in advance what potentially the response in those circumstances should be. Mm-hmm. So that puts you on the front foot straight away.
And also, I think the ability to be able to go, like, if there's an event happening. So if we look at, Print Nightmare, for example, right, and looking at the saga with potentially fixing that issue, and the fact that the patch didn't actually fix it, made it worse. But the point is being able to go through your environments and be able to validate that you are exposed, but also making sure that your environments aren't being attacked when you're exposed, right? And that's really important, right? So someone isn't executing attacks against your potentially unpatchable systems in that particular scenario, right? Or whether there's a particular form of word propagation, like things like WannaCry, not Petra, things like this, right? Yeah. So, or supply chain attack. We're worried about, seeing a massive supply chain attack. Being able to monitor for those things and knowing what to look for, seeing the indicator of compromise, and being able to then monitor for that and be able to say, we now have something we're proactively monitoring for rather than reactively. It makes the complete difference for having that degree of confidence when you're asked by, as a CISO or whoever it may be, asked by your execs to say, can you prove to us that we're not exposed? And you can say, this is the detection capability we have. We're monitoring for these things and we haven't seen it yet, but we are monitoring for it proactively and we have the confidence in our monitoring to be able to tell us if that happens.
Yeah. Peace of mind.
I think in some degrees, yes, you can never have full peace of mind and security, of course, but a degree of peace of mind, right? And a degree of confidence in the ability to manage that risk.
Yeah, and as a partner to, definitely as a partner to your customer, it's your responsibility, I believe, to ensure that the service is extremely well defined. And that, not every single service that is delivered is the same. In fact, more often than not, they are different. Obviously the structure of that particular service stays the same, but the components of it, the information that sits behind it, the use cases that define the service, and all of the things you set up around it, as we've talked about, policies and procedures, etc., and defining roles, they're different.
Yeah. Well, every organisation has a different setup, different risk appetite, different technology stack. There's always going to be intrinsic challenges that mean that you can't, there's not a one-size-fits-all, but there is an approach and a methodology you can use to counter that, right?
And that surely is a value in terms of working with partners that provide that service, because it's the expertise, the knowledge, the proven and predefined frameworks that you can adapt and work towards.
Absolutely, and I think that's the key. And just to cover off the last point here, I know this is a very large pyramid of pain, but it is really important. Can you kind of, deploy countermeasures to kind of contain and recover? And I think the key thing here is that when you're kind of under attack, having the confidence. This is the thing that we talked about like this morning, literally, as we're preparing for this. One of the things that's really important is, from my experience as well as in incident response, right, is you've gone through the process, you've evicted, you've contained, and you've deployed countermeasures to stop an attack from, hopefully reoccurring. It's having that ability and that confidence to say, we know that we have resolved this incident. We're not going to have anything else that's going to happen, right? Yeah. So I think that's really, really important, to have that and have that confidence and the ability to monitor for that, Because ultimately what we're trying to do here is prevent, detect, react and respond. There's a huge part of that detection and prevention are very key to enable you to react and ultimately to respond to the right things. Which does bring us into pretty much the same thing, but from a different perspective about the importance of detection in that framework. When we're talking about incident response, it supports it. As we said, having the right identifying those assets, knowing we've got the right controls in place that would give us the data, not just to stop something, but something does happen and it's not prevented, but we have the right data to be able to see the attack from happening in the first place. We're monitoring the right sources to be able to detect. And then that good data, good data in, good results out, right?
Exactly.
So, and so we're trying to make sure we'll be able to do that, because otherwise we don't have the right data, we're not able to get in.
And just before you sort of move on from there, we talk about respond. And we know there's two types. There's post-incident response, there's pre-incident response. If you look at the investment made by organisations in that part of technology or service, a vast majority of it is in the pre-incident response preparedness, because if that's okay, then that mitigates risk, but obviously puts you in a really strong position to try to get it under control if something does happen. Whereas the opposite side is literally just responding to it as it's done.
And do you know what? This is a really good point. You just triggered sort of a case study about this as well. One of the things I really, especially when I talk to organisations, especially organisations that have managed detection response in place, is if an organisation has or wants a capability of a managed detection response service, the first thing we look at is typically their incident response plans and their ability and their training they've had, if they've done any desktop scenarios, all this kind of stuff. Because ultimately, what you don't want to do is to put something into an organisation where you're going to send alerts and then no one knows what to do with them. And then what you're doing really is adding to workload and potentially creating confusion. Right? So part of that service is to elevate the skills or to provide a framework to allow that organisation, as part of that service really, to say, right, so before we even onboard this, we're going to do some training, we're going to look at your processes, we're going to put in place a framework to say, if you get a P3 alert, typically we're talking about this needs to be dealt with within sort of 48 hours. And this is the type of level of thing we're talking about. But this can change, and this may change and elevate, but these are things we need to do. So you almost start to map out that kind of incident workflow, put the coverage in place, train the people and how to deal with those incidents. So you have a higher chance of success when the service is live, to be able for them to consume and take action with confidence, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think what we're saying, in essence, is an MDR solution is not just an MDR solution. When you look at it holistically in terms of the effectiveness and value of that service, it has to have the processes at the start and procedures, and you have to define and you have to train and develop, and you have to enable the organisation to test and make sure that when the alarm does go off, everyone knows where to stand, where to go, who's reporting, what the line of communication is, how do you document all the information, and then ultimately right through to incident response, because the incident response preparedness side of it is ensuring that you know how to respond in those circumstances, and put all of those three components together. And actually, when you talk about MDR, really, what we're saying is that all of those components should be included in that solution. Absolutely,
100%. And I think there's a sort of story I tell about an incident that happened many years ago, but it was pretty interesting. That when there was a major ransomware outbreak that caused issues with taking out computers, the first thing to be hit was a SOC, right? And because it was an in-house SOC, so the same machines were being switched off. The SOC analyst couldn't access the SOC itself, so therefore their ability to contain the event was pretty significant. And so you talk about blind spots and things like this, that if your SOC, in-house SOC is the blind spot and there's no backup and recovery plan for your SOC, because that you think, well, no one's going to attack the SOC. If you can attack the SOC and you can take it out, you can inhibit their ability to recover, then what you have got is a problem. Your eyes, you're blind, you've just blindsided the entire organisation, and this happens quite a lot. And so you need to be thinking about when you're outsourcing that capability, or what you're really doing is building resilience.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're building because you're relying on that organisation to have those plans in place. Those
plans that is a really valid point, and you triggered something in my mind there as well, which is sometimes in circumstances you think that when you place a SOC and the capabilities that surround the SOC as a service within the organisation, that essentially puts everything else under control and everything's monitored and you should be okay, and that's a big tick in the box. But actually, that's not the case, because the solution will only monitor part of the estate that you are putting through the SOC itself. So, and this goes right back to what we talked about right at the start, which is crawl, walk, run. So this is about optimizing the service. The service is there, and over time it's important that there's a relationship, internally and externally, if that's the route that you take, in order to review the service and ensure that you're optimizing that service. Now, as you said, that could be changing use cases, it could be changing policies and procedures, it could be bolting on incident response training and preparedness, but all the time it's about expanding the monitoring capability within your business, it's about identifying the assets and the types of assets, and knowing really full well what good looks like within that business to enable you to then protect on a wider scale.
Could be red team
It's not
purple
just
teaming.
it's not just you put it in and essentially that's all of your concerns and worries taken care of, and that's so important to note.
Well, it is, because ultimately what we're doing here is it's an evolving, moving. As you said, it's a shifting sands, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, you've got to move with it, because ultimately your infrastructure changes in terms of the organisation. Infrastructure changes, the threats change, use cases change, people leave, and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
All you've got to do is make sure you understand what is it we're trying to monitor, what are the things we need to monitor against, what are the things that's going to give us the best data sources, and that may change. So we might make a massive investment in a new piece of technology, like, well, we should be consuming that.
Yeah.
But that should be front of mind. It should be, what else can we monitor? What else is going to enrich the service or give us better ability to detect these things?
Yeah, and it's a fine balance, because there are circumstances where I've had discussions with customers direct where, they've essentially said, this wasn't picked up on our service that we delivered. When you look at it and break it down, it's because it's not monitored. You have to have a plan and a roadmap in terms of the type of or areas of your estate that you wish to put through that process, and that will widen your engagement in that respect and deliver the value that you're looking for. But you can't just put it in and leave it.
Yeah, it has to grow, has to evolve.
Yeah.
Yes, excellent. Well, talking about detection and talking about the importance of use cases and things like this, right? I'm a big fan of the Mitre attack framework. You may have heard me mention it before, once or twice on this.
Just a few times.
Just a few times. I mean, we might have mentioned it 3 or 4 times yesterday, for example. But the point is, right, I've always been a really big fan of Mitre attack framework. And I'm thinking, well, this is brilliant for when you're building out your detection capability and when you're thinking about building out your, attack simulation, right, in terms of trying to understand, what capabilities you need to detect for, right? And then fairly recently, the NSA in America open sourced and released their own framework using Mitre, but the Mitre Defend framework. If anyone hasn't actually downloaded this and looked at it, I highly recommend it. It's an amazing knowledge base. It's not complete in terms of it's got everything, but it's a really good starting point. So if you're thinking about, well, I need to understand what hardening services I need to think about, what I need to harden, what do I need to detect, how do I isolate, deceive, all this kind of stuff, right? And degrade and all those great things. It really is a great place to start. But for the focus of today's call and seminar, the idea is to understand that building out use cases is a time-consuming thing. If you're doing it yourself, I just want to give you some examples here, right? So I'm going to pick out network analysis, right? So looking at network traffic analysis is one of the kind of subcategories, right? There are 18 countermeasures and monitoring services you need to look at for network traffic analysis, right? And there's also a whole bunch of things here. And each one of those then has its own, so looking at administrative network activity, for example. Each one of those has how it works and how you would do it and what you might look for and what kind of services might you look for. And you've got to build up use cases for that. So the great example, and I had this conversation literally yesterday with somebody, is like, well, this customer uses TeamViewer, right? And they use TeamViewer, which is in itself bad, but they use TeamViewer and they use another service for remote desktop, right? And that's all they use. They don't use anything else, right? And they only use it through these services internally, and they'll only use it at these times. And these people, the only people have access to it. So all of a sudden, what we have defined is a profile to say if anything deviates outside that, we know that these people would use it because they're the people who would naturally use it. We now know the ports and services that were activated to use that service, and they lock down which ports and services that TeamViewer can use, because they can split between 443 and 80 and all this kind of stuff. So they lock down the services it can use, and 3389. And then what they've then done is they've defined a profile. So we now know if anything deviates from a hunting perspective from that, we now know that's an attacker trying to do something, or someone breaching the policy and process that's been put in place, either an insider, accidental insider, shadow IT or whatever it may be, right? Or it's a malicious actor.
Yeah.
And that is a use case, right? And it's something we can hunt for, something we can react to, and it's something we can hunt for. We've got to do that for all these different services within an organisation. For example, we could think about another technique. For example, we could think about user behaviour. I mean, that in itself is not even just categories, hundreds of use cases for user behaviour based on groups, based on departments, based on applications. You start to build these things up. And what we end up doing is try to profile our business. So trying to define your use cases, even if you go and buy a SIEM that has a bunch of use cases and detection capability out of the box, you still have to make that relevant to your business, or you still have to define which ones are relevant to you and what you want to monitor. The idea of outsourcing some of that functionality is that you can say, these are things we care about, and that organisation should be able to go, well, that's your use cases.
Yeah, and I would say 9 times out of 10 in circumstances there'll be very bespoke use cases. No matter how many use cases are predefined, you will always have that capability requirement.
And you have to, because as we've talked about throughout this session, every organisation has some degree of risk appetite or some degree of unique kind of environment that requires those particular use cases. So I guess what we're trying to say here in simplistic terms is it takes time to build these use cases. It takes time to build the detection capability. But I highly recommend, if anyone's just interested in just looking at the attack framework, we'll after this, when we send out the white paper for this session, we'll also include that as part of the white paper as well, so you can check it out yourselves, because it is highly recommended. And if anyone uses the Mitre attack framework, they'll be able to use this as well. So we've kind of gone through this process. I realised this a second ago. We've gone through this process, not really explained how MDR kind of works and how it all ties together. We've kind of talked about monitoring, we've talked about detection, we've talked about response, but we've not really talked about how this all kind of fits together. And really, in simplistic terms, what we're talking about is intelligence and signal intelligence. So we're talking about, and when I talk about signal intelligence, I'm talking about your deep and dark web surface monitoring. So we're looking at what's outside of our organisation, whether that's someone trying to attack our IP addresses, so we're doing IP monitoring or something like that, or whether it's someone talking about us on any forums or on Telegram groups or whatever it may be. There is some kind of surface monitoring to develop some form of intelligence capability. This could be the intelligence can also be considered consuming feeds, so IOC feeds or malicious domain feeds or whatever it may be, right? And then the signal intelligence is the stuff that's in our side of network. So the IOCs that we see through our network traffic analysis, or we see through our EDR or our endpoint detection or our IDS, whatever it may be, right? And we see that happening. Or Active Directory, which is obviously domain controllers. We're seeing authentication failures. Or 365, we're seeing people spinning up, for example, a Teams group that's publicly open to the internet, right? So SharePoint's open. I mean, that's never happened before, right? So, so there's the kind of things that we think about. And that then feeds into the Security Operations Centre, which forms a part of that service. Then the analysts will then go and review the logs and correlate those through the use cases, through the threat hunting, whatever it may be, to get an event. When they've classified the event, it's about escalation. And to your point earlier, Pete, it really is about that process, right? You talked about the instant response process.
Yeah, exactly.
And how that's defined and how that sits in. And then it's about going back through that loop. So when you mentioned earlier on about the instant response kind of preparedness, if you don't do the instant response preparedness, you don't understand the assets you're trying to monitor for, you don't understand what your threat profile looks like, how can you then prepare, right? And how can you then respond when you're seeing data? So these things are all very closely linked together.
Yeah. And the more you go into it and the more data you cover to do that, the better equipped you are to respond, because it's almost like muscle memory to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what I'm really keen to discuss here is the skills and technology required, because I think these things are very closely linked, right? And this is something I'm really kind of keen on, right? And this is something which I'm talking about with internal security operations as well as a managed detection response service. But if we look at analysts, themselves, and the security analysts that sit within a SOC and within any organisation really in that sense, there are some important skill sets to factor in. And there's always, everyone talks about skills gaps, and we're not looking, or we're looking at challenging finding the right kind of analysts, or we're asking too much. I mean, the amount of times I've seen job specs for security analysts, and they're asking for CISP, for example. I mean, it's not, you need to have 5 years of experience, for example. The security analyst roles and the lower tier 1 levels are probably seen to be full entry level roles, if that makes sense. So I think, we've got a challenge in the industry where we're asking too much from analysts, or we're not understanding how the role sits and their responsibility with the organisation. I think it's important to say that there is most certainly things that we should be looking for when we're talking about analysts, and why it's important to talk about this is because we'll talk about the importance of retention and things like this. But ultimately, knowledge of networking and operating systems you would expect, right? And of course, knowledge of threats and understanding how to investigate those and triage, because ultimately without those skill sets, you can have good data fed to the analysts, but if they don't know how to then take that information and correlate that and what sources to then feed into that particular investigation, crucial data may be missed, right? So it's important to have that. I think the critical thing for me out of all of this is that understanding of IT processes, because security operations in itself is understanding the operational IT model as well. So it's about understanding how this process works and where does it fit in the overall scheme of things, right? So it comes back to your point that you made earlier, having the right defining process in place and someone understanding where that is.
Yeah, and you have different levels within the SOC as well, and it's important that in most cases they tend to work through those levels and gain the knowledge as they're consuming the service. So that's an important point as well. And you're right. Once you have that level of expertise, it's difficult to retain it
because these people are incredibly valuable, right? So what you end up seeing is, and I've seen this many times. You can find a really good SOC analyst, train them up, and you upskill them. They become a level 2, and suddenly someone picks them up. And off they go, exactly. And then you're doing the same thing again. So your retention of knowledge is really important in these kind of services, and
which actually makes it even more important to have your processes in place, because as you're changing personnel and people are joining and moving up and going into different roles, that has to stay constant.
Absolutely. Otherwise, you lose the valuable knowledge, right? And a good knowledge base from the SOC is so important. Right? So important. And this comes back to my point about what's required. So if you're going to talk about today, I'm going to build my own SOC, right? We're going to build a SOC P, right? Today, right? What's required? We're going to think about what do we need, right? So we need good data, right? And data from all these sources, right? So we need to look at our cloud environments. We need to look at, any intelligence we want to consume. We need to think about maybe the devices we're taking. So when we look at domain controllers, we might look at feeding in logs through our 365 environment. We might also take logs through maybe the devices themselves. Maybe we'll stick some endpoint detection and response in there, we'll feed those logs in, or we'll take the antivirus logs, and that'll be enough. There's so much stuff we need to think about just to get the data. And then we need some expertise. So we now need some people to take that data and process it somehow. So as we talked about, we need to have management in place to make sure we've got the good leadership to drive that SOC forward, to have a good SOC manager, which they're pretty hard to find. Right? And then we need to have someone who can then do the event investigation management piece. So we need to have someone who's going to work with that organisation to take that almost CSIRT type position to coordinate and investigate and escalate major incidents, because you can't have your analysts doing that. Okay. Then you need to have your tier 1 and tier 2 analysts, and then you have your tier 3 for real sort of special use cases. And we probably need some threat intelligence analysts as well, because ultimately different people. Some people are really good at that intelligence stuff, but they're probably not security analysts, or they sometimes are. But you want people to be generating intelligence to feed your analysts, right? You need to have an intelligence function as well. And of course that could be outsourced, but then you can take the intelligence feeds in, but then you need someone to create the actual intelligence to do something with it, right? Because then at that point it's just data, right? So we've got expertise, we've got data. Now we need to build our SOC. We need to make sure we know what data we want to capture. We know who we want to hire. Now we need to have the SOC, and everyone just goes, we just get a SIEM, don't you? Just get Greylog, right? Get some open source Greylog, and off we go. And actually, it's not. It is about the ticketing. It's about having a good ticketing or good process in place to actually be able to build that. It's about having a good analytics engine to be able to process the data and be able to make correlations. Now, usually, good modern SIEMs will have that analytics engine built in, but you might also want to drop it into other sources, right?
Yeah, and you've got to then configure it.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got to have a SIEM that's got analytics engine. You've got to have the ability to do tickets. You don't want that to be your SIEM. You want to keep those separate, so in case there's an issue, the SIEM goes down or something like that, or your ticketing system goes down, but you've still got the raw logs and all that kind of stuff. Intelligence, And of course, technology, we've got to have all this stuff to take it from. So we need to make sure we've got, our endpoint detection, our antivirus, our IDS, our firewalls, our artificial intelligence, machine learning type technology that might give us some ability to do some of the heavy lifting. And of course, vulnerability scanning, file integrity monitoring, etc., etc., etc. The investment is significant. Right?
Time and resource.
100%. And we talk about challenges, and I'm not trying to talk people out build their own SOC, but we're trying to make people realise this is a journey, right? Whether you outsource and whether you go through a service where you literally consume the alerts and you consume the value, or whether you build and manage yourself, there is a massive cost. Now, the cost of a SOC, it depends how long's a piece of string, right? And how much you're going to invest and what that SOC looks like. It can be a small investment, and it could be a smaller, sub 500,000 or 200,000, or it could be much more than that, depending on your organisation, your scale, the people, of course, because that's your biggest overhead, and the technology, and the subscription. It's costs for that as well, so it could be significant, right? But we talk about 24/7. Now, this is something which is really interesting, because if you think about some organisations who don't have a 24/7 operation at the moment, but they want a 24/7, this happens quite a lot. I need a 24/7 SOC. And I go, brilliant. So do you want 24/7 monitoring, and someone to review the monitoring? And do you also want 24/7 alerts? So can I call you at 3 in the morning, and your dedicated numbers, whoever I'm going to call, maybe 3 or 4 people, whoever that process is, right? And you're going to pick up the phone? No. So what you want is 24/7 monitoring, but you want to be notified in business hours? Yes. Okay, great. If someone says, no, we've got a service desk that's 24/7, feed it all into there, fantastic. You've already got a 24/7 operation, you just don't have a SOC.
Yeah, exactly.
Great, that makes sense. So understanding your level of maturity. Now, the larger the organisation, of course, if you're a mid-sized organisation or enterprise, you're going to have a 24/7 operation most likely anyway, right? So it's about understanding how does that fit into that operation. Does this have a catch-all? Does this have a number you call? Is there an overflow number? All that kind of stuff. We need to make sure we've got it, right? So it's important, right?
Well, things happen outside of business hours.
Do they?
So I'm told. And it's important to be able to monitor, to be able to detect that continually, and if required, be in a position to respond to that.
Absolutely, because attackers don't just work in business hours, apparently. I've been told once or twice before. They never wait till 5 o'clock on a Friday, do they? No, never wait till then. You never get your ransomware attack at 5:30 on Friday, knowing that the weekend is now ruined for everyone. Not only the fact you've got a ransomware attack, your weekend's ruined as well. And I think that's the key here, right? It's about trying to understand not only the fact there's a cost of building, there's a cost of running, and there's a cost of continuously retaining people and upskilling people and training. There's a huge investment. And the time to build a SOC and run out a SOC in most cases can be anywhere from 6 months to 24 months, depending again on the complexity, size, your investment, and what your operational model looks like. I'm not talking about deploying the technology, I'm talking about having the defined use cases and having
and being able to go live.
And being able to have the reporting functions and having all the incident response in place. So I think we're talking about quite a significant investment. Now, let's talk about some quick wins, because you can actually make some significantly quick wins. When talking about monitoring, because actually we do this all the time. It's like people say, we want to monitor the ocean, we want to monitor everything, and it says everything is happening everywhere, and you're like, well, we can do that, but then we're going to have a lot more to process, and actually you're probably not going to get the right type of information. So you want to start strategic, and strategic deployment is the way to go, because ultimately what you want to be thinking about is, what are our critical assets? What are the things that we care about, and what's going to be that path that we're going to take to monitor? So when you think about this, right, we go, right, we need to define right now what our critical assets are. And these could be a criticality from an availability point of view. So you want to know if that system goes offline. We don't have a knock, but actually we want to understand you can't see that device anymore. You can't see that service. That's important to us, right? That's an early indicator of something that might happen. That might have a knock-on effect to loads of other things, right? It might be that this particular service is a legacy service, right? And it cannot go offline for a second. It could be so critical to the organisation, we can't even update it, right? We need to know if anything happens to that or anything gets anywhere near that, right? Or it could be an integrity thing. The accuracy of this data has to be completely important to us. So we need to be thinking about file integrity monitoring and things like this. So whatever we're trying to do, we need to be thinking about what those assets are, whether they're endpoints, firewalls, data, infrastructure, whatever it may be, right? And
so focus on the critical assets, focus on the area of your estate that is potentially going to be most at risk and could essentially, if breached, cause most problems.
correct. The idea is, and there are many examples of this, right? So you might turn around and say, we could use many breaches, and there's been one breach, and I'm not going to name names in this particular seminar, but a very famous breach where someone left a Apache Structure 2 server exposed to the internet that led to 148 million records being stolen that might have something to do with credit monitoring, right? So, you might say, well, okay, but that wasn't necessarily a critical asset, but it was linked to a critical asset, and that's the key, because no one had it in their asset register, so no one knew that this asset actually had access to those records, which is really important. So we're not just talking about the assets themselves, but the routes to compromise the assets. Do we understand what's connected to that? How would someone get to that asset? Work backwards. I start here, how do I get out to over here? What would an attacker have to do to get in? Who would they have to compromise? What systems would they have to bypass? What networks would they have to pivot from? Maybe in some cases you have a flat network, then technically speaking, everything's in scope, right? But the key thing here is understanding what to monitor. And this is where we go into the quick wins, because ultimately what you want to be thinking about is, where do we get the data to be able to detect these things, right? You will get it off the service itself, but if you can't see, if you can see, I can get to the asset, I'm on the asset, and you get an alert, that's too late, right? You want to be seeing it over here somewhere. And so we're going to be thinking about what we're going to go for. And some of the obvious ones are clearly, I want to be focusing on your anti-malware, anti-spam, your endpoint detection response, if you have it, or have that endpoint detection response built into that service. And I also want to be thinking about any kind of IDS to look at network traffic and firewalls. Domain controllers are your friends. As far as I'm concerned, they are fantastic sources of information if you know what logs to monitor. If you take all the logs from a domain controller, you'll just be filling up a database. You need to know what logs to take and what to pull and what's important versus what's not important. And this comes down to expertise again, right? Office 365, or if you're using GCP, that's quite important as well. Or AWS, look at the logs from AWS, Azure AD. These are things that are really, really important. Authentication services are great. If you're using SSO, single sign-on, then actually that's quite important, because I want to be able to see if anyone's trying to abuse that, right? If anyone's trying to spin up new services or trying to bypass that service, right? And then identify those critical applications and service and the routes to compromise those. You could be talking about, in a very large estate, a handful of critically placed services you're monitoring that give you huge amounts of data and scale, which actually would probably give you the same if you monitored everything, right? Yeah. Because you're strategically placing your eyes on the network.
Well, exactly. And what you're doing is you're covering the critical parts of your estate that you feel, through your reconnaissance work that you've done, that they present the greatest risk to your organisation. So you don't always necessarily have to go as deep and wide as you can. More often than not, it can just be about the critical assets and the path to those assets.
That's your crawl, walk, run, right?
Yeah.
We got there. I see you tied up quite nicely. I thought that did. Well, that's pretty good there. Right? And this is what's important. And if we go back to our Mitre attack and defend, this kind of ties in quite nicely, because if you think about it, we're doing some monitoring. So we're going to see that early reconnaissance and initial access through that signals intelligence and monitoring we're doing. We're going to be thinking about, someone gets initial access, we're going to be thinking about the log sources we're monitoring, or that containment that we can do to stop these things from happening. And the point here is that if you have visibility across the attack chain, your use cases are wide enough to be able to give you the visibility. You've monitored the right sources to give you the data to be able to give you the visibility across those sources. You're in a good place, but your investment isn't necessarily significant. And that's the difference. You get peace of mind, you get expertise, and you get visibility and the data to be able to make accurate decisions and respond quickly earlier in that life cycle. And also contain as well, right?
Yep. Very important.
I think there's something to kind of bring up to here, right? Now, we talked about ransomware at the beginning, right?
Yeah, I like this slide, by the way.
Do you? I think it's quite pretty, isn't it?
Yeah, it
colours.
is.
It's nice colours. It's nice to have some colour. It's not all black and white today. Right, so I wanted to bring this up because what's very important is to understand, okay, well, we're thinking about the log sources we're going to monitor. So we're building up a use case here. We're going to go, right, let's pick ransomware, because we've talked about ransomware, and I know everyone says, oh, not ransomware again. Everyone talks about ransomware, but it's an easy one to talk about. You start going to other use cases. We could be filling up 5 screens full of attack vectors. We know the attack vectors at the moment are going to be phishing, where the attack vector is going to be some form of exposed VPN or SSH service or whatever it may be, right? And we know it's probably going to be some form of account compromise. There are different ways, there are obviously more ways, but at a high level, they're the things that are going to happen. And then the attacks themselves are going to be, well, if I'm going to deliver phishing attack, what do I need to think about? How's that attack made up? So we're really thinking about the exposure is going to be a malicious URL or it's going to be a malicious attachment, okay? And from there, I'm thinking SSH, RDP, all these kind of things, right? I'm thinking, what are the attacks against that? What are the things I need to be thinking about? I need to be thinking about port 3389 being open, exposed to the internet, which is a big no-no. Always check Shodan for that, just to make sure. Vulnerable VPN service, so you might be using a VPN service that has a vulnerability that allows an attacker to, for example, authenticate without actually providing any credentials, which has happened before. Or there might be some kind of misconfiguration in your VPN service, or there might be an account compromise, which we can talk about later. And obviously, SSH brute forcing, someone actually being able to get hold of SSH keys or being able to brute force that to be able to gain access as well. And then we're talking about the account compromise, right? We're talking about some kind of cloud admin or root account or admin account, domain admin, whatever it may be. Obviously, that's the keys to the kingdom, right? As we talk about every time, it is the keys to the kingdom. And we see it quite a lot, right? So that could necessarily come through phishing. It could be password reuse. I think you get the idea, right? The whole point is there are different attack vectors that you can start to map out. And then you start to think, well, where are we going to monitor for those things? What do we need to think about in terms of sources to monitor to be able to give us the ability to detect and prevent these things from happening? So we think about the web filtering we may have, or mail filtering, any network traffic analysis to be able to get the context of what's happening across your network. So things like NetFlow, other things like that, for example. Your MFA and Intune, for example, to give you the ability to make sure we've got the control to protect, but Intune might give us the ability on what's happening on those devices and the policies. You've got a whole bunch of things. Azure AD, EDR. I mean, you get the idea, right? The point is,
I mean, it's essentially a good plan.
It's a starting
Gives you
point.
a great base.
Starting point. We may have other sources, and like I said, I could have built this out to have all the sources you'd monitor, but you wouldn't be able to read any of this. So, it's a starting point, but it gives you an idea. And this is what we're talking about, is that there is a starting point to everything. And if you're monitoring for these things and you have all that data coming together, what you can then start to think about is, have we got the right coverage to protect ourselves from these type of attacks?
Yeah. Perfect.
This. Benefits. So we've talked about what monitoring is. We've talked about how we do it. We've talked about some of the downsides of building your own versus outsourcing, all this kind of stuff. The upsides, and there's benefits to both, of course. Yeah. But we're going to talk about, for a couple of seconds, we're going to talk about why you should really be thinking about outsourcing and actually having the benefits of a managed detection response service. And, really, if you think about it, we're talking about multiple services that are going to come in. We'll talk about this in a second. There are multiple services we'll be talking about. So we're talking about Azure, AWS, your on-premise, and then of course you're talking about all these type of things that you can have as part of that. So we can take the logs across your organization through APIs or syslog or having an agent deploy or something like that, right? You can start taking those data sources very quickly and being able to spin that up and then provide a number of conditions around what we're going to look for on top of that. So we're not just going to take the logs and stick it into a scene. We're talking about that kind of capability to be able to do that. And what's really important here is we're not worried about where we're collecting from, because we're thinking about, okay, we're going to put something on the network, so we're thinking about the internal network, so we're thinking about, okay, let's take stuff from servers, and let's take our domain controllers, our critical Windows services, right? We're going to take stuff from, syslog, our firewalls or IDS. That's going to spin into our kind of virtual collector. We're going to have this hosted in the cloud, so we might as well have it hosted in AWS, for example, or we'll have it hosted in Azure, so we'll start collecting stuff from Azure as well, in Office 365. Any applications we want that sit within there, so maybe we'll take some stuff from, System Security Center, for example, in Microsoft. We might take stuff from Event Hubs, from our WAFs, and we'll pipe everything from Azure firewalls or our Azure WAFs into Event Hubs and take that as well. The really great thing about having a flexible collection service is that we don't worry about where we're collecting from or what we're collecting. What we want to know is why we're collecting and what the benefit of collecting that is. Speed of deployment is one of the things that we're going to talk about. Ultimately, this is a really quick win for organizations. We can say, you've got cloud environments, we'll take it through an API. You want to take other stuff, we can take it through event hubs. You've got stuff on site, we'll take it from on site and spin it up directly into the cloud. You want to have this all hosted on your site, we can just host it all on your site and pull stuff down from the cloud into your environment where necessary. Right? Where it's hosted and how it's hosted, the collection, doesn't really matter.
No, and that's a good point, because they can be prohibiting to certain organisations depending on how you've got to collect those logs. So if you've got that multiple source of ability to collect, then that just makes that service even easier to do.
Absolutely. So, what should be included? I think it's quite important to bring that up.
Yeah.
So I think we both agree on this, you should have a SIEM, right?
Absolutely.
I think we've
pretty critical.
I think we've probably covered that off today. Do you think? I think we might have covered that off, right?
Yeah, I think you're probably right.
Now, intelligence is quite important as well. I'm not talking about analyst intelligence, I'm talking about threat intelligence. Sorry, right? And what's really important here is to build up that that multiple source of intelligence. Now, we're not just talking about pulling in stuff from malicious domains or indicators of compromise, or pulling hashes down on a regular basis through VirusTotal. All these kind of sandbox environments. We're not talking about that. We're talking about developing our own intelligence and cross-organizational intelligence as well. So we're talking about signal intelligence. We're talking about proactive intelligence. We're talking about looking at dumps and data dumps to understand whether a new account compromise has come up. Looking at Paste, looking at Telegram, all that kind of stuff to kind of really build up that kind of proactive intelligence, and then build up that indicator signal intelligence as well. I think it's important to start looking at your external IPs as well. As part of that, we should be thinking about, yes, we're monitoring all our external perimeter, but we should be monitoring it for change. It's quite important to say, actually, this IP over here is pretty critical, and all these services hang off this IP, and all these ports, the ports have been open forever, but suddenly someone's just opened up this port. That's a problem. That's a change. Now, that may be a legitimate change, but it's a really high-numbered port. That's actually quite a concern. Why would someone do that? So someone's opened up 9001. That's a really unusual port to open up. Why would you do that? Right, so we start looking at those high-level ports to understand, why should we do that? Well, actually, someone opens up 33890 the internet. Fantastic, and that should be closed down immediately, right? So we're just trying to understand what changes are happening, and this is about situational awareness, right? In that sense, identifying file integrity and being able to monitor for that as part of a MDR service. I think, would you agree, quite important?
Yeah, I think all of these are important, but again, it's about when you onboard technologies of that kind of nature and those capabilities. Whether you do it at the start or whether you do it as you're moving along your roadmap. But I think what is important is that it's defined in terms of where you want the service to be. Yeah. And then you've got a plan in order to get there.
I think also, I think looking at configuration of your, one of the things that, in fact, this is a really good point, right? So, and it's reminded me of something really interesting. One of the things that we see on a regular basis, if we're talking about ethical hacking, right, is misconfiguration, right? It's one of those things which you can have vulnerabilities, you can patch regularly, and that's one control. That's a control, right? That's to say we patch, our systems are up to date. But if you have misconfigured your network, or you've misconfigured even permissions and groups within AD, for example, right? Or you've misconfigured your segregation of networks. Actually, there's a service that's open that could just sit straight through. If you've misconfigured something, even in the cloud, cloud misconfiguration is very popular, right? The whole point is, right, if you've done something and you've misconfigured, that is going to be abused by attackers, right? And that is going to be the thing to say, well, fully patched, how do they get in? Or how are they able to get through this? We've got all these controls in place. Misconfiguration in controls. For example, you have amazing monitoring, but certain parts of the network aren't being monitored. Or you've got amazing IDS capability, or you've accidentally whitelisted a service, which can then now be abused, for example. So all these things can be part of that kind of layer of things you want to be aware of. And so actually being able to look at that kind of endpoints and those services, to be able to look at the configuration of them to understand whether the configuration has changed or whether the configuration potentially leads you to being at risk, is something which no one really thinks about.
No, not at all.
I think if you don't have intrusion detection at the moment, having that as part of the service, I think is quite valuable. being able to see that and enrich your data is actually quite
Absolutely.
valuable. Reactive is not good in most cases. Sometimes it's good, but actually having the ability to be able to hunt for logs and hunt through those logs and pick out the information that's quite important, I think it's vital. You don't want to wait for the alarms to go off to tell your house is on fire. You want to be going and hunting through the rooms to check there's no fires before you go to bed. Right?
Yeah.
Nothing worse than waking up with a fire in your bedroom, right? So I think it's quite important at that point. And of course, okay, everyone talks about, and plenty of companies that talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence and all this kind of stuff. And I think it's important to have some form of automation, right? And I'm not saying AI advocate for you should be replacing analysts with AI, because absolutely not. But you should have a harmony between the two. Some form of automation, some form of machine learning that can give you the ability to have better data for analysts to review that becomes more accurate over time and actually learns from those experiences.
Yeah.
I think it's so important. It just makes the service much more efficient. It means you can do more with the same resources, right? Which means it scales cost and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So
and becomes more important and relevant over time.
absolutely, if we're seeing regular activity and we can actually see that regular activity is happening and there's a pattern of behaviour, we can start to plan and monitor for those patterns. We can then start to do like almost not predictive analytics, but we're starting to head towards that kind of area of saying we know our highest time for phishing emails is Wednesday at 3 o'clock because that's when the attackers think that we're all reading our emails, for example. We can start to predict those kind of behaviours and patterns and start to map it out. I think we talked about this, but I think really, really important. You should be able to see what's going on in your environment. You should have a portal. You should have a portal to say at any time, I want to see what's going on in my environment. I want to be able to go in and delve into the data that the SOC analysts are seeing maybe.
Yeah.
I want to be able to see that data. I want to be able to pull that data out. I want to be able to say to my CEO or CIO, whoever it may be, to say, do you know what? This is what's happening. This is what's happening right now. You're worried about these particular events. I can prove to you that we've monitored for those things, and these are the outputs.
Yeah,
from that.
absolutely. And I think, I think in my experience, it's a critical thing to provide to a customer. It's not always something a customer looks at.
Yeah.
Because they would prefer, they just want to know that capability is there. And what it will do is promote a two-way communication between ourselves and the customer, so we can see data and we can communicate and talk about that data that's there. And that can stimulate communication and therefore improve the relationship and the service overall.
It's
So
about
quite
refinement,
important.
isn't it? It's about refinement and actually saying, do you know what, and I think the important thing as well is that having a dashboard is one thing, but having a dashboard that helps you with your own internal workflow is quite important.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we talk about quite frequently is about, well, how would you use a dashboard? What do you want to use it for? What information do you want to see?
Yeah.
You wake up in the morning and you look at the dashboard. What is it that you want to see?
Yeah.
What order do you want to see it in? What information is going to be the most important to you? What's going to be least important to you?
Yeah.
Knowing that you've had 50,000 alerts in the last hour, is that really going to be useful to you unless those alerts are malicious? 50,000 logs being processed in the last hour.
Yeah, so that's about defining the service as well, isn't it?
Exactly.
At the start, and you might take that as a capability for granted, but in actual fact, it's really important to have that.
Absolutely. So, I think we've talked about all these anyway.
Yeah.
But I think we can both agree, hopefully.
I think we can.
I think we can agree, right? That MDR as a service, or any kind of SOC as a service, will help identify and protect your critical assets if you have the right processes defined. You've done the incident response preparedness. You've understood who your critical assets are in the first place, because you can't identify and verify and protect your assets if you don't know what they are, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important to say that that is what we're trying to do here. We want to protect, everyone wants to protect our critical assets. We want to know that we've got eyes on our assets.
Yeah, look, if you're going to invest in this kind of a service, then you need to ensure that the way in which you invest in it delivers the most amount of value and return.
Absolutely. And of course, has a reduction in the potential impact and reputation as well, those things. We haven't really touched this too much because we haven't talked about MTD and MTTD and MTDR, so mean time to detect and mean time to respond. But ultimately, it's all about reducing that time to detect and that time to respond. The earlier you detect, the more effective your time and the delta between the detection time and response. There is that real big delta time. If I detect something, how long is it going to take me from the time that I first detected something to the point where I contain it? And if your delta is big, and you've got a big gap, a huge amount of time, it doesn't matter, that attacker's moved on. So the quicker you can detect something, the quicker you can provide that data to be able to respond, the more effective you are going to be in your response process, right?
Yeah, and let's make, no excuses for it, but, ultimately what that will do is enable an organisation to potentially protect their brand, their reputation, and ultimately there can be financial risks and penalties, through breaches. So it's enabling you to respond as quickly as possible in the most effective way, which hopefully over that period of time reduces your financial risk as well.
Yeah, 100%. We haven't really talked about compliance, and I think it's really important to say that this supports. So compliance doesn't always equal security, right? And actually, that's a whole different topic in itself. But ultimately, we still have obligations, right? And so part of those obligations would be to think about monitoring against ISO 27001. So if we were actually looking at standards that we are actually certifying against, such as ISO 27001 or PCI, or actually making sure that we have maintained the obligations for UK GDPR or EU GDPR, depending on where you operate from. It's important to have that, right? To have that ability to say, we can not only monitor for threats, we can monitor to make sure that we are being compliant, that we are saying we have a least privilege model, we're able to monitor that we follow those principles, and we actually can demonstrate that. We can monitor our joiners and leavers process to make sure that when someone does actually leave the organisation, that account's then removed and people don't try and we can see the deleted accounts that week, removed accounts. We can also see new people that join, and actually for me that's a really big, good example. Like joiners and leavers process is a really good use case, right? If we know pretty rigidly that on a Monday new accounts are created, right? Every Monday, right? We have a joiners, Friday they're reviewed, Monday they're implemented by service desk. So any new people join the organisation, we know on a Monday. We see loads of new accounts created on a Thursday. Delta, there's a problem here, right?
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying that. I think that element of it, whilst it's important, that you're able to meet those standards, some organisations it's far more critical than others. That might be a driving factor, enabling them to move towards an MDR solution. So having the ability to provide that is critical. Really critical and important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also helps underpin it, right? So you can say, well, actually, we can actually see and we can actually prove that we are meeting those obligations. And you can then provide the evidence to support that, right? Which is really important. Evidence is important for auditors, right? So being able to do that is quite important. I think we talked about intelligence, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore. I'm conscious we've got time. We need to have time for questions. Everyone will be lucky to know we don't have 20 more slides, so it's okay. And the importance here is, reducing the reduction in the potential costs and impact of the attack.
Which we talked about.
We have already talked about. And of course, one thing we haven't really talked about, and this is like the most important thing, at the beginning we're saying the time to onboard a SOC is 6 months to potentially 24 months. We're talking about a month. We're talking about a month. And I'm not talking about that's getting the logs on board, that's getting the services defined, that's getting the policies defined, that's getting logs into the SOC and use cases deployed against that, and getting alerts and reports, daily reports and monthly reports in a month. Which I think is pretty, it's pretty quick.
Yeah, it's brilliant, and that's because we've got predefined, proven processes as cells to work and deploy the services, and because of the expertise of the people that are doing that, it just makes the experience a lot better.
And it helps, right? And it helps an organisation that needs that rapid deployment and almost that kind of assurance that and we talk about this. We talked about this again this morning. Is that if you have that ability to say, I know within a degree of confidence within a month I'm getting logs into the SOC and I'm starting to see those use cases activating whilst tuning happens, right? You've got 30 days of tuning on top of that, but you are getting logs and they're being tuned and analysts have got eyes on screens, right? The point here is that you can then start to say, well, we now can then look to see retrospectively, is there something beaconing out, for example, we have never seen before, right? We can start to see that very quickly. When you're doing it over 6 months, you may miss those use cases you're building. So I think it's quite important to say that. So that's what it is. We're looking at all those things and the benefits, and it's a service that ties quite nicely together. And I think we've actually hit, within about 15 seconds, the exact time for questions and answers that we've set aside. But I'd like to say, Pete, I think it's been an absolute pleasure having you on here.
Listen, it has been a pleasure. I've fully enjoyed it, and I think what I wanted to really get across was it's not an isolated service in itself. In order to be able to get the best value from an MDR, there has to be an element of the processes, defined people, and there has to be an incident response preparedness program, because that will essentially equip you for responding to the information that's presented through that SOC service. Absolutely,
and what we see quite frequently, and just to kind of add to that point, is that organisations that just rely on that kind of post-breach support service, such as always having to pick up the phone and call the incident response guys, are never really learning from that experience. They're not taking that valuable information and those skills and imparting those skills and empowering their people to be able to do this. So I think you always need to have the bat phone you pick up and call the parachute the guys in to do incident response. But you should also really be empowering your people to get used to containing and eradicating, and then having that defined process that they can follow.
Yeah.
So much more valuable, empowering.
And that is an actual good point to finish on, because I think as part of that service, it's about upskilling the team that sit internally as well, and that's around the knowledge, their capabilities, and their ability to be able to respond and manage a service themselves. So over time, if working with the right partner, that will naturally take place.
Becomes a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
I think that's a great word to end on today. I guess it really allows me to say thank you everyone for joined and stayed for the full hour and a half. We really appreciate you joining us today, and we are going to be doing our final session in around about 4 weeks, which will be on knowing your threat landscape. Yeah. And there will be a number of guests joining me this time. But I'd like to thank Peter for joining us.
Listen, I'd like to thank you. I've had a fab time, and most importantly, I'd like to thank you for placing us in a room at 45 degrees throughout the entire process. It's been a pleasure.
And it's been nice, actually. I'd like to say I've actually lost about 3.5 pounds just from here. Yeah. But, that's fine. It's hot outside. It's hotter in here. Yeah. But the conversation has been good. And look, thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you in 4 weeks. And also, don't forget, there will be a white paper you can download that will be sent to you fairly shortly. And anyone that hasn't quite done this session, you can watch the recording of this as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I've been Stuart Peck.
And I've been Peter Farrell.
We'll see you soon.